I'm speaking today with Michael Zerbs, the president and COO of Algorithmics, risk management experts, of course. We spoke to Dr. Zerbs last year at the Asian Banker Summit, and we're speaking to him again today. Thank you, Dr. Zerbs, for speaking to us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Sure. So I guess the thing that I think is on everyone's mind is Basel III. You're very interested, of course, in Basel III, especially on unintended consequences. There's a long list. The one that I'm most familiar with is, of course, the impact on trade assets. But maybe can you get a little bit into what your thinking is on the topic, and maybe walk us through what you think the hot points are?
Of course. So I think maybe the starting point is that the industry and regulators have made a lot of progress with Basel III. A lot of new regulations have come out in many different areas. But as always, there are unintended consequences. We fix one thing and we create another problem. And let me just give you two examples, one of which will be trade finance. So the first example I would like to start is quite often what happens is we aim to control risks. But as we aim to control one category of risk, we create other risks. So we might control counterparty credit risk by asking for more collateral. But now we have operational risk because collateral has to be provided, has to be sent back and forth. We might create liquidity risk because somebody has to fund that collateral and those funds have to be available. So that's what I mean by unintended consequences. I guess trade finance is another good example where the objective was to make sure that banks' leverage stays within certain limits, that off-balance sheet liabilities, potential liabilities, are better understood and better controlled, and where we ended up is a much higher credit conversion factor for trade finance. Now, I think it's unavoidable that whenever new regulations are put in place, that there are some winners and some losers, and some parts of the balance sheet are treated better than others. But I think it's important to keep in mind that trade finance is indeed is a critical part of the export economy, and I believe there are some efforts underway to take another close look at it.
Are we on a slippery slope here, really, where we take 2 steps up and we slide back 3 steps down? Because clearly, if you're, I guess, negatively impacting trade finance, then ultimately you're going to negatively impact trade. It's going to negatively impact economies, and the banks are going to suffer along with everyone else.
I think it's a good example of one aspect of Basel III, which I personally don't like too much, namely a strong focus on very specific asset classes and specific regulations around those asset classes. So I think we'll probably address trade finance. There will be a way to deal with the consequences. But then we have yet another exception and yet another rule. Just as we have different rules for incremental risk, for CVA, for various other different aspects. So I think the danger here is that we create a very compartmentalized view of a bank's balance sheet, and that indeed would slow down growth. It would make it more difficult to understand risks and to manage risks.
This is all about regulation, of course, but it's not just about regulation, it's also about supervision. Where do you see the sort of proper balance between regulation and supervision? Some commentators have said that there's been too much regulation, not enough supervision. So where do you see that?
I think that's an excellent point. I think supervision has to be much more hands-on. It has to be much more intrusive. Supervisors have to really try to understand banks' business models and judge the business models. And one trend that I've seen and that I personally think is a very encouraging trend is that supervisors take much more interest in a wide range of stress tests. And I think those stress tests will help them understand what banks' business strategies are, will encourage dialogue with financial institutions, and will help supervisors and institutions to better understand the risks respectively.
Right. I guess in the last year or maybe 2 years, we've seen quite a few different flavors of stress testing. There's been the public announcement of stress test results. There's been there's been the internal disclosure. There's also been variations in the way the U.S. stress tests and European stress tests have been conducted. Where do you see this moving, and do you see any progress in the way stress tests are conducted?
Right. I think the stress tests, the way we've seen them announced and publicized, are a starting point. Certain assumptions were made, certain base scenarios, stress scenarios, etc., were being created and used. But most importantly, there was a clear statement on the assumptions, on the scope, on the objectives, and all of that allows us now to go back and go deeper and say, well, was that assumption reasonable? As we run another round of stress tests, what can we learn from the strengths and weaknesses of the first round? And I think that will help us over time to develop much more stress tests that go much more in depth and that are much more defensible, much richer, and lead to much more discussion.
Okay. How rigorous do you think the stress tests are that you're seeing? I mean, clearly there's been so many black swans recently that it's not becoming an irregularity at all. even this tsunami as well has impacted the banks, not just the nuclear and the energy industry. Do you think there's a need for more rigor?
I think there definitely is, and I also think that from Algorithmic's perspective, having a strong risk platform, a strong and consistent way to actually assess different risks, to make sure that the way a stress test is conducted in one part of a bank's book is consistent with the way it's done in another part of the bank's book. Those are essential preconditions, because doing stress tests by spreadsheets is very hard and also very dangerous in terms of consistency, or inconsistency rather, of assumptions. Now, having said that, I think as time goes by, for sure will increase rigor, for sure will increase consistency, but the objective of a stress test is not to capture every eventuality. In the end, all we can hope for is a better understanding of how banks' business models evolve under stress, of how they would react, of educating everyone on possible mitigation strategies. But I think we have to be clear that no matter what we do, another financial crisis will happen at some point. We can just hope that we have better tools in place to mitigate the outcome and to respond faster and more effectively than last time around.
Are there any best practices that you've seen in stress testing? Where would you say that they're being done in the most refined way?
I think the key to stress testing is to focus less on instantaneous shifts of many detailed micro variables, as in small changes or larger changes rather in interest rates or exchange rates or something like that, but to really focus on the longer term, to really say, well, if a housing slump continues for another 3 years, what impact would that have on the capital ratio of a financial institution? To then say, well, how would different asset and liability categories evolve? So really taking the longer term view. Is a business model sustainable? Does management have plans in place to raise more capital, to sell off assets, things like that? So I think best practice is going in that direction, and that's a good thing.
So you're looking more long-term and big picture rather than...
Exactly. The objective of the stress test is to really find out whether a bank can survive, whether the business model does well. It's not whether the bank will lose 0.2% of capital tomorrow.
Okay. And in terms of, I guess, data analysis, are we already sort of there in terms of being able to crunch the numbers, or are we still behind the curve?
I think still bank systems in many areas are still silo-based, and a lot more work has to happen at the data level as well as the analytics level to bring together the underlying data, to have consistency in analytics, and to deal with long-standing separations between, say, the banking book and the trading book, even though the underlying risks are quite similar. So that's still work in progress.
Okay. You're speaking today about credit value adjustment. I wonder if you could give us some thoughts about what you're going to be talking about.
Sure. So maybe just to define the term, the fundamental point of credit value adjustments is to make sure that changes in credit quality are properly assessed, are properly marked to market in derivatives books. In the last crisis, credit value adjustments actually caused roughly 2/3 of all losses in counterparty credit risk. However, no regulatory capital was provided because the regulatory capital focused on default and not migration. So when we talk about CVA and when regulators talk about CVA, the key objective is to make sure that losses due to migrations, losses due to credit-related mark-to-market events are properly captured. In practice, a lot of modeling assumptions have to be made regarding CVA. And I think one of the dangers is a false sense of accuracy or a pretense of knowledge when indeed we don't know. So I think CVA is a good thing, but I think we have to be careful to properly understand the assumptions we're making, the assumptions that we are not making, and treat the resulting numbers as work in progress rather than as a number that's positively right and not subject to model risk, not subject to revisions over time.
Known knowns and known unknowns.
Exactly, and I think a lot in CVA is still a known unknown, if not an unknown unknown. I mean, maybe to give you just one example, there's a lot of talk about wrong way risk. Wrong way risk is fundamentally the risk that at the same time as you are owed more money by a counterparty, the credit quality of the counterparty also declines. Intuitively, it's an easy concept. Practically, at the modeling level, to properly and deeply and fully capture it is really, really hard. So usually there are two choices. You ignore the problem and hope it never happens. Well, that's clearly not the right answer. Or you just try to improve models over time to better and better capture the wrong way risk as one example.
Okay, I see. Okay, thanks very much for speaking today, Michael, and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you.
Thank you.